All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Mythic Existence. I'm your host, Jack Daly. Today, we have a fascinating topic in store for you, and that is the different types of magic. We'll discuss the difficulties involved with defining magic, trace the development of European medieval magic, and read excerpts from little known texts such as the Three Books on Life and the Arbatel of Magic. So sit back, relax, and enjoy another episode of Mythic Existence. So, magic is a topic that I've studied academically for about 7 years now. It was one of the things that I really focused on as a history major in college. I've talked about this on previous episodes about how, even though I'm a folklorist now, really studying history was the first kind of academic love that I had. And so I have a really kind of historically driven view of how to study folklore and the, kind of similar topics. And I think that magic is something that folklorists definitely can study, and they do study it. And so I think that this fits in well with just kind of the overall paradigm of this podcast. So I really think that this should be a great episode. It's a topic that I'm really passionate about and have been thinking about for quite a while. So as opposed to some topics that I give just a couple of weeks of, researching into, this is something that's been years of built up. Really, my introduction into the academic study of magic was in the first kind of upper level history class that I had in college. And I'm not going to go too far into this because I know you might not find this quite as interesting as the, theory that we're going to get into. But just to give you some background, I started researching British witchcraft, and it was actually a pretty big change in how I viewed what history is just in general, because I was originally studying Elizabethan England and was kind of thinking about doing a project about the monarchy. And because that's kind of, you're growing up in high school history and stuff like that, and there's such a focus on the ruling class and like wars and stuff like that, which is what a lot of people think about when they think about history. But of course, it's far more, far deeper than that. And I was introduced during that Elizabethan study to John Dee, who was the court astrologer and the mage par excellence of Elizabethan England. And it just completely opened me up to a whole new world of study, and that is of the study of magic, which most people might not even realize that that's a thing. Most people might not even think that magic is real, but in human history, magic has had an extremely, extremely important role. It's something that probably will never go away, much to the chagrin of people like Max Weber, who was a German philosopher who famously said that the world was disenchanted with the coming of rationalism and empiricism. On the contrary, magic is still very much alive, the theory and the practice and the study of magic. So that's what we're going to be kind of getting into, is definitions of magic and different types of magic and everything that goes along with it. There's a million different ways to go with it, but we're going to be kind of focusing on the nuts and bolts, so to speak. So defining magic is an inherently difficult task. It's something that scholars have wrestled with since magic has been at the forefront of, scholarly investigations. One of the biggest pieces of comparative study on magic, and how it is different from religion and science and stuff like that, is James Frazier's The Golden Bough, which was written over a little bit over a century ago. I forget the exact date, but it's not the freshest text now, but it was kind of a huge jumping off point in the field of comparative religious study, which is kind of where magic falls into. So James Frazer, when he was coming up with his theories of magic in the Golden Bough, he differentiated it from religion in that it is immediate and individual. It is really for a single person in their, attempts to create and, harness the powers of nature. That was the theory, but it's far more complex than that. That's, the individual aspect was something that people focused on for quite a while, as opposed to the communal aspect of religion. However, now we know that magic can be and is very communal. Probably the best example of that is how Wicca is practiced nowadays, with the coming of Gardnerian witchcraft in the 50s, which was after James Frazer, but I think it's safe to say that magic was a communal effort. It didn't necessarily have to be individual. Another thing he says that differentiates magic is that it's manipulative and coercive, meaning that the magician is trying to coerce the powers of nature, the spirits, and other inherent powers of the world, the universe, into acting really occult forces is how you could think of them, as opposed to religion, which is typically supplicative, meaning that you're trying to appease the god or gods by things through prayer and ritual, going to church and things of that nature. But again, once you think about it, religion can be coercive and magic can be supplicative. So it's a really blurred boundary. The scholar Richard Kieckeffer, who wrote a book, Magic in the Middle Ages, which I have right here, one of the best book covers of all time, he talks about magic as being sort of a crossroads between science and religion. And I think that that's a decent way to go about it, because there is science in magic and there is religion in magic, and there is magic in science and there's magic in religion. They all kind of overlap together. They're not rigid boundaries. They're more of, kind of a very complex and interrelated system of knowing, of epistemologies, ultimately. And one thing that is very similar between science, magic, and religion that Frazer says is kind of, important in magic is mechanical types of actions, things like incantations and spell casting, potion making, drawing the power down from heaven in astral magic. Those are things that we also do in science and religion, as far as performing lab experiments or in doing mechanical in the sense of, actually trying to work through something in, any number of rituals that are performed during a mass or a ceremony that are very common. So they're actually more similar than people might really think. Religious people are often very anti-magic, but they probably don't realize that the most famous book of magic, the most famous grimoire, is the Bible itself. One of these things that makes studying magic very difficult is that some people argue that it's, a very Western-based concept or construct, and that's definitely a fair argument, because magic, as we view it, often comes through the European lens, and I'm going to be guilty of really focusing on a lot of European magic during this podcast, because that's what I know the best. And it's kind of the thing of, you believe I know the theory of myth, right? Or, just the theory of belief in general, magic is a loaded word. And just because, one culture might be practicing what they call magic, or what we call magic, that might just be something totally normal to them, if it makes sense. So ultimately, calling something magic is a value judgment based off of what we think of what magic is, if that makes sense. So let's get into some more definitions of magic. One scholar, Michael Bailey, he says that, there's a problem of time and place in studying magic. That's kind of what I was talking about earlier of, it's magic changes throughout time, basically, and that's something that I focused on in my studies, which I'm going to get into further later, is how the conceptions of magic change. They haven't been the same. During the Middle Ages, they changed wildly and are still continuing to change. So it's a very fluid topic. I want to talk about also why it's just important to study magic in the first place. A lot of people, who aren't in the humanities might, think that these kind of studies are irrelevant or not necessary. But studying magic gives a real lens into how a culture views the universe and reality. So as we'll see, the medieval Christians who had a very negative view on magic because they thought it was inherently demonic, that gives us an idea that, the idea of demons being antithetical to God, and just the existence of demons and the existence of God was very important to them. And so it's absolutely necessary to understand cultures throughout time and space to get an idea of what was valuable to them and why things happened, and ultimately why things are happening today. In medieval Christianity, like I was saying about, magic was viewed as being linked to heresy and blasphemy and idolatry at the beginning. So that's another reason why defining magic is difficult, is because it changes. In classical Greece, magic religious rituals were thought to be invoking spiritual entities called daimones. And, you might be familiar with Socrates' daemon, which was basically a voice inside of Socrates' head that he called his own daemon, that kind of shaped the way he thought and formulated what he thought he needed to be really doing. And over time, these daimones were transformed into the demons. And so once Christianity kind of overtook pagan ideas, they were literally demonized. And so one scholar, Valerie Flint, says that magic went through a process of demonization, and it quite literally did, because the daimones were transformed into demons. Oftentimes, the definitions that we get of magic and what we know of magic comes from specific authorities, whether those are spiritual authorities like Thomas Aquinas, or if they're, the law itself. One way that you can study how magic was viewed was by looking at, edicts and laws and court trials that were carried out against practitioners of magic. So sometimes we get probably too much of a top-down view of what magic was, instead of maybe the medieval folk view of what they thought magic was, mainly because they didn't have the resources to actually, write down what they thought. They didn't have their own podcasts where they could come on and talk about their experiences as magical practitioners. So that is all to say that defining magic is difficult, because it changes. There's not one definition for magic. It's different over time and space. But if we were to try and define it, here is a shot at it. Magic is the art of compelling nature through supernatural means to produce a desired result. So that's a packed sentence, and you can see sort of the crossroads of magic between science and religion there, because you're trying to compel nature to produce a desired result. That's what science does. You're trying to get a specific thing to happen. You're compelling it, you're manipulating it instead of supplicating it. You're coercing nature, but you're doing it through supernatural means, which is where the concept of the occult and of hidden powers in nature comes in. So that's our definition of magic. It's not perfect, but I think that it's pretty good. So for the rest of the podcast, I'm going to talk about how magic basically developed throughout the Middle Ages in Europe. And that will allow us to dive into different topics of magic, different types of magic. Magic existed in Europe before the Middle Ages and it existed after. I wrote my capstone project as a history major in college about black and white magic through the Middle Ages, and I kind of realized that it'll give us a jumping off point for talking about all sorts of different magic, whether that's white and black magic, divination, astral magic, witchcraft. All of that good stuff can be talked about through studying medieval magic. So a couple of real basic concepts I want to touch on before we get into that is sympathetic magic and contagious magic, which are real big kind of topics to understand kind of the magical theory and how it worked out. I talked about this a little bit in my previous episode 2 weeks ago, where I covered the archaeology of counter witchcraft. So you can go listen if you want to go into more details, but simply put, sympathetic magic is an umbrella term that basically is founded on the principle that like produces like. So it's also homeopathy, sympathetic magic. If you do one thing and another similar, like a voodoo doll, the person being used is an imitation. I'm sorry, my cat is meowing right now if that's coming through on the podcast. Frequent guest, but she's fine, I think. Contagious magic is based off of the thought that things that are in contact with one another will influence each other. And so we can think about, the witch bottles I talked about being, and the witch bottles in that previous episode, being kind of both sympathetic and contagious magic because they were reflecting the thing that they were trying to imitate, and there was, urine and hair or whatever that was used to kind of get the principle of contagion going. So those are just basic concepts that I want to hit on because they didn't really come up, or well, they're kind of running throughout all of the things I'm going to be talking about. So let's get into black and white magic. These are basically these two big terms that I was looking at when I was researching medieval magic. And black magic is basically magic that is done through using demons or demonic forces, devilish forces to do your magic. Whereas white magic at a certain point was basically, natural magic and philosophical magic that was using hidden forces. So, things like alchemy, astral magic, those sorts of big topics were the white magic that came around. But at a certain point in the Middle Ages, it was thought that only magic could be done through black magic. So let's start with antiquity, which is basically the period before 500 AD in Europe. And like I said, one of the main sources of magic and magical belief is the Bible. In Leviticus, it says that a man or a woman who is a medium or necromancer shall surely be put to death. They shall be stoned with stones, and their blood shall be upon them. So, we have a really, really negative view of magic at the very beginning of, the Judeo-Christian religious complex, basically. And in St. Augustine of Hippo's City of God, Augustine was kind of the source, the ultimate source for medieval practitioners, or medieval people just in general, and especially the clergy, about magic. And in his book City of God, he said that evil spirits instruct people how to use magic stones, plants, and animals to do magic. So that's how they thought things were being done, was through these magical stones and these plants for making potions, and animals. Obviously there's a long tradition of familiars and cats and stuff like that as being something that witches were in consort with, basically. And that right there is basically talismanic and amuletic magic. Talismans and amulets, we use them all the time, but basically talismans and amulets are magical objects that either have inscriptions or don't have inscriptions on them, that are believed to have some sort of magical power to them. For example, I've got plenty of talismans just sitting around me on my desk. This is an example of one. The one thing that's really interesting with talismanic magic is Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin was a magical practitioner. All of Led Zeppelin were. That's one of my favorite bands. And Jimmy Page consciously used magical symbols on his clothing, and obviously they all picked out magical symbols from ancient magical texts to be their logos. And so he was trying to consciously, affect people by his talismanic magic when on stage, and he was really thought of himself as a magician casting spells over people with his music. So that's one good way to think about it. Moving on to the Low Middle Ages, which is 500 through 1000 AD, the main focus at this time was the problems of potions and fears of being poisoned by, your neighbor by magical potions. And there's a book called The Leech Book of Bald, and I've got a quote from it of how to make a potion that I want to read off. It says, "Take goose fat and the lower part of elecampane and viper's bugloss, bishop's wort and cleavers. Pound the 4 herbs together well, squeeze them out, and add a spoonful of old soap. If you have a little oil, mix it thoroughly and lather it on at night. Scratch the neck after sunset and silently pour the blood into running water. Spit 3 times after it, then say, 'Take this disease and depart with it.' Go back to the house by an open road and go each way in silence." So that's what you get when you're reading from these medieval magic, potion books, which I just kind of wanted to read it because I'm not exactly sure what to make of it, but it's an interesting formula nonetheless. And in the year 900, a very important religious, I guess I don't think it's religious, but a law was passed called the Canon Episcopi, which says, part of this law against witchcraft and magic said that certain wicked women who believed that at night in the company of Diana, goddess of the pagans, and in innumerable multitude of women, they ride on certain beasts and pass over great distances of the earth in the depth of night, and obey her commands as their mistress and are summoned to her service on particular nights. So that's what the belief was in the year 900 about how, people actually carried out their magic. And it's important to kind of clarify these two different terms, especially when, witchcraft is brought up. And that's diabolism and maleficia. Diabolism is demonic magic, which again, at this point, everybody thought that all magic was black magic and therefore diabolic magic. And there's also maleficia, which is harmful magic and magic done with the intent to cause harm. This potion wasn't necessarily one that would cause harm, but you could make a potion that would be considered maleficia. So if you were doing malicious magic, you would also be doing diabolic magic, and you would be in quite a bit of trouble. The example from the Canon Episcopi, this is an example of what was called phantasmata. In the text, they said that these people were actually imagining things that weren't there, and that the devil was tricking them into thinking that they were doing these magic flights. So they didn't actually believe, the people didn't actually believe that these magic flights were happening. But this might be a little bit even crazier. They thought that the devil was tricking them into thinking that this was happening. So that is the Low Middle Ages. During the High Middle Ages, which is 1050 through 1350, we had a huge change in belief. Now in this time, people from the Arabic world were entering into Europe, specifically through Spain, when the Moors were conquering Spain. And at this time, we had Arabic texts being translated. And two of those texts were the Picatrix and the Emerald Tablet. Now, the Emerald Tablet, we've now know it dates between the 1st and 3rd centuries Common Era, and they were actually written originally in Europe, but when they found them, they first thought that they were actually dating back to this mytho-religious king, Hermes Trismegistus, and they thought it was ancient, but it turns out it actually wasn't. They did, linguistic analysis to find out that it was actually somewhere between the 1st and 3rd centuries. They were originated in England or in Europe, survived in the Arabic world for centuries, and then were reintroduced into Europe around the 11th century, I believe. And the Picatrix is a book of astral magic. And basically what astral magic is it's using the stars to harness the powers on Earth. And so you can think of it as basically mechanistic white magic. And so with that realization, people started to think, well, magic can be natural then. The Picatrix doesn't need any power of demons for this to work. So this was this huge paradigm shift where now white magic gets introduced into Europe. I'm going to read off from the Emerald Tablet purely because it's one of my favorite texts through history. It says, "Statements in the words of the secrets of Hermes Trismegistus. This is true without lies, certain and most true. What is below is as that which is above, and what is above is as that which is below, to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. And as all things were made from one through the meditation of the one, so all things were born from that one through adaptation. If the father is the fiery sun, its mother the watery moon, the wind carried in its womb, its nurse is the earth. The father of all perfect and sacred things in the world is here. Its power is complete if it is turned upon earth. You should separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the dense, smoothly and with great mastery. It ascends from the earth into heaven, then descends again to the earth, and takes into itself the power of higher and lower things. Thus you shall have the glory of the whole world, and darkness shall flee from you. This is the force of all forces, the power of all powers, which shall overcome all that is subtle and penetrate all that is solid. This is how the world was created. From this there will be wonderful adaptations, and it is the means. For this reason I am named Hermes Trismegistus, the triple magus, since I have the 3 parts of wisdom of the whole world. That which I have spoken on the working of the sun is finished. So always, that's one of my favorite texts. There's quite a bit to dive into, but I don't think we need to. The main maxim that comes from it, of course, is as above, so below, which is, the powers in heaven are down here on earth. So not only did, purely demonic magic go away and white magic opened up, the divinity of man was rediscovered in texts like the Emerald Tablet and the Corpus Hermeticum. One man by the name of William of Auvergne, he wrote a text called On the Universe in the 1230s, and he said that those things worked by natural magic are not an offense against the creator or a wrong, unless someone employs the art either too curiously or for evil. So right here we have, in the 1230s, William of Auvergne is saying, look, natural magic is not bad. It's not demonic. If it's malicious, if it's maleficia, then it's bad. But natural magic is fine. Another man by the name of Roger Bacon, he actually started to doubt the reality of the magic. He cites things like Carmina, which were incantations, and saying this is just the natural order of things. So then we get into the whole discussion of what is natural, what is supernatural. Is anything supernatural, or is it just extremely natural? And he also said fascinatio, which are enchantments to do harm, they're fake. Like, they're just made up. And he said that in his book called the Opus Maius. So that is the High Middle Ages. Now white magic is available for us. Turn to the late Middle Ages, 1350 through 1500. That's when the infamous text, the Malleus Maleficarum, comes up, the witch's hammer. And this is when fears and paranoia of witchcraft start to flourish. And obviously, terrible things happen mostly in the early modern period. But the ideas were starting to be, built up at that time. So we have that. But then on the other hand, we have this Hermetic revival of the Renaissance Neoplatonists that was started with the translations of the Emerald Tablet and everything like that, proliferating, and Renaissance humanism and the rediscovery of the divinity of man and stuff like that, running completely in this opposite direction. One of these great Hermetic Renaissance Neoplatonists was Marsilio Ficino, and he synthesized Neoplatonic mysticism and magic into one phrase, as he said, nature is everywhere magician, which that's poetic, it's succinct, it infuses the world with that magical order, which is kind of the point of this podcast. And he believed that the world had a soul, a world soul, or there was a cosmic spirit that was infused into everything. And Marsilio Ficino also wrote a book called The 3 Books on Life, which had a chapter called On Obtaining Life from the Heavens. So we have some more astral magic in Ficino, where he says that the Arabic writers prove that by an application of our spirit to the spirit of the cosmos, achieved by physical science and our effect, celestial goods pass to our soul and body. This happens from down here through our spirit within us, which is a mediator, strengthened by the spirit of the cosmos, and from above by the way of the rays of the stars acting favorably on our spirit, which not only similar to the rays of nature, but also then makes itself more like celestial things. So, I mean, we have a lot going on there, obviously. The main idea being is that we can harness the power of the universe, and that's kind of what magic basically is ultimately. So then we have the early modern period, 1500 through 1700, witchcraft running rampant. But I'm going to focus on two quotes from two books of magic, which they're grimoires is what they are, is the technical term. A grimoire is basically just a book of magic. And this will prove that now, the views of what magic is very different than the antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages. The Arbatel of Magic says that a magician is no other but divinorum cultor and interpres, a studious observer and expounder of divine things, and the art itself is none other quam naturalis. I'm going to skip over that Latin phrase, but it's the absolute perfection of natural philosophy, is basically what he's saying. There's a mixture of it in all things, good and evil, of falsehood with truth, corruption with purity. So it's like, it can be bad, it can be good, but it's basically just natural philosophy. And the magician should be somebody who's figuring out the divine nature of themselves and of reality. And then the Goetia says that magic is the highest, most absolute, and most divine knowledge of natural philosophy, advanced in its works and wonderful operations by a right understanding of the inward and occult virtue of things. Whence magicians are profound and diligent searchers into nature, they, because of their skill, know how to anticipate an effort which to the vulgar might seem a miracle. So that right there, that's the crossroads of magic and science. They're knowing how to anticipate an effort, but it's also the most divine knowledge of natural philosophy. That's magic right there. Perfectly summed up by the Goetia. So that's it for today's episode. Magic is a fascinating topic that demands to be studied. Learning about a culture's attitudes towards magic can shed light into their values and how they view the structure of reality. So go ahead and read your Ficino, and maybe you can obtain life from the heavens. Thanks for listening. See you next time.